Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the Light Up the Darkness podcast. I'm your host, Erin Edwards. In full transparency, I just wanted you all to know that many of my episodes had been recorded prior to a lot of the things that have come to light regarding George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and the brutal killing of Black people that continues to happen at the hands of the police in this country. So I felt it of the utmost importance to pull this episode together, to contribute whatever I could to the cause, and to also provide a sense of hope and potential healing for my community, for us. So in today's episode, we're discussing moving through racial trauma with my amazing guests, Naiylah Warren and Thérèse Kempf, both licensed mental health professionals, and they're dropping gem after gem in this episode. All right, let's get into it, guys. Welcome to Light Up the Darkness, Naiylah Warren and Thérèse Kempf. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. I'm so excited.
Me too. Today we're going to talk a little bit about trauma. It's not really, it sounds crazy to say I'm excited to talk about it, but I'm really excited to hear both of your perspectives and your expertise on trauma and healing. So I would like to begin by asking you both to give me a little bit of background about your experience and your therapeutic style. So would you like to begin, Naiylah?
Sure. So my name is Naiylah Warren, or Nye for short, usually. And I was born and raised in Brooklyn. And being from Brooklyn, I think it taught me a lot about the grit that you need to sort of survive. And it also gave me a strong sense of how important it is to also laugh and have humor in life and kindness in life. And so I really brought that into my therapeutic style. And by training, I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. So that would be LMFT. And in my therapeutic style, I like to be really conversational. I like to take a really empowering approach, very nurturing approach. But I also really usually just heavily focus on spirituality in the way that I like to process things with my clients. And my clients tend to come to me because they are looking for a spiritual perspective, because they already move and operate from a spiritual perspective as well.
Thérèse, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah. So my name is Thérèse Kempf. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, so an LCSW. I am a trauma therapist and a couples therapist. Those are my specialties. I started working in trauma about 10 years ago. With torture survivors, with asylum seekers who were survivors of war and torture. And then I kind of moved on to work in interpersonal violence at a crime victims agency, and which I still work at as a supervisor. And yeah, I mean, privately, I primarily I am seeing folks of color. I see a lot of women of color. So I'm dealing with trauma in the sense of interpersonal violence, sexual abuse, physical abuse, domestic violence, etc. Also dealing with racism as trauma and collective trauma. And then with my couples, same thing. I have a lot of mixed race couples and a lot of folks where one or both have a trauma history, and just to see how that impacts their relationship in the here and now. And as far as like my practice beyond my specialties, I'm really a body-based therapist. So I do sensory motor psychotherapy, which essentially is a treatment that it's a framework that really uses the body as the main source of information as well as the main source of healing. So I kind of integrate it in the work I already do. And that involves like a lot of body scans, a lot of meditation, and a lot of just using kind of like cutting through the cognitive aspect of our experience and really using the body as a main source of information about our sensations, as well as a main source to process trauma.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for that.
You're very welcome.
So trauma, we're talking about trauma today, collective trauma in the Black community. I want to begin by defining trauma. I personally have struggled with wondering what is trauma specifically? Like, how do we know that we're experiencing trauma? Can you speak to that?
Ooh, um, when I think about trauma, and there is tons of obviously like Webster's dictionary versions of it, but I like to think of it as in juxtaposition to the way that medicine thinks about trauma. In medicine, they think about trauma as a physical injury, right? And in mental health, we think about trauma as an emotional injury that has been caused by a gamut of experiences, that can be caused by a gamut of experiences, whether that is an physical injury, whether that is emotional abuse, whether that is systems such as racism. Thinking about it as anything that causes sort of an emotional wound in that way, from experiences that really have sort of shaken and traumatized the system and really have sort of just sort of overloaded us emotionally. And that comes out in so many different ways. I know we're going to talk about that, but that's the way in which I like to think about trauma.
Do you have anything to add to that, Thérèse?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, and Naiylah and I were talking about this last weekend. I mean, I think the vernacular and the language for trauma has expanded so much in the past couple of years, and it's become such a common phrase that we talk about. And, I would say historically in my work and just kind of in the trauma field in general, trauma has, it used to kind of be defined as like when an event, like it's like a single incident that overwhelms your ability to cope and feels like you or someone else's life is threatened. That was always kind of the traditional understanding of trauma, which assumed that the trauma was like a single incident or like a series of incidents, like, a natural disaster or like sexual assault or something like that. But I think that we've really expanded that out, right? Because, when you think about like poverty as trauma, immigration as trauma, racism as trauma, these are pervasive, insidious, and there really isn't like an end to it necessarily, and that end is unpredictable. So I think that, the elements of trauma, which are really about like a lack of control, a sense of helplessness, and a sense of chaos, I think that is somewhat unilateral across the different trauma types. But I think that, again, we've expanded trauma to include other types of trauma that are ongoing.
Right, exactly. So let's talk about that a little bit. Racial trauma. So what does that mean exactly? I mean, we're all part of the Black community. We understand what is going on, what racism is, but how is that trauma? How do you explain that?
I'm trying to think about the most comprehensive way because I think that it is it's such a heavy, combination of words. But in short, I think racial trauma is the emotional injury of experiencing consistent and persistent, one, racial inequality, but also flat out aggressions towards you based on your racial identity, violence as a result of your racial identity to you or to your community or the people that you love, um, the systems that pretty much stagnate you, and how just systemically how racism comes in to sort of limit the way that you can move and operate in the world, and the sustained impact of experiencing all of those things and the ways that we then behave as a result of experiencing that is a traumatic event.
I love that. I love that definition. I think that's really comprehensive. And just to add a little bit to that, I think that, when we talk about trauma, I think when we use that word, I think the assumption is that it has to be like something that completely overwhelms you and, you are running for your life or something like that. And, racial trauma can be very covert, right? And it can be that persistent gaslighting, the persistent microaggressions. And I think that I actually almost look at racial trauma as similar to how I look at domestic violence victimization, because the lack of accountability, the gaslighting, the sense of entitlement, the need for power and control. I mean, I think all those elements are there when you are when we're talking about racial trauma.
Yeah. So when we talk about racial trauma and how it affects Black people, what are some of the manifestations of that we would see, that we would be needing to look out for?
Yeah, I mean, I think, beyond some of the more blatant examples of violence, right, of like physical violence, like what we obviously, the murder of George Floyd, that's like a perfect example of that physical manifestation. I think it also, the way that it shows up primarily in myself or even with my clients is a persistent sense of self-doubt because of the like continual gaslighting. So, especially like in corporate America, I hear about this all the time where, like passed over for promotions or the snide comments or the having to work so much harder or being asked to, do tasks that are completely out of scope, right? Or being singled out or not being invited to these things, or like, being like, especially now, like being the poster child for diversity and inclusion, and the expectation of having to, be the voice of, Black people when you are going through a very lived experience of racism. These are all examples to me of racial trauma. And it's not necessarily, it doesn't have to be like so overt, right? But it still is really damaging and can cause that sense of like, what is real? What is actually happening? Is this, do I have a right to feel like this? Is this actually what I think it is? Those types of things.
Yeah, yeah, I would also echo that, Therese, in saying that there are tons of ways that this manifests. And I think with trauma, we all know that people experience it and also react to it differently. And everyone's, while we know that there are some common ways that we may react to trauma, there are some very specific, nuanced ways that we do across cultures, but also just individually. But I think two things that really stand out to me in that is the impact on our self-esteem and self-worth. And being, of course, in environments that are microaggressive or aggressive to you, environments that do gaslight you, there can be this sort of pervasive feeling of not being enough and always trying to strive and sort of overwork yourself in being seen and being heard, because in these environments, they don't see you at all. They don't acknowledge you at all.
Right.
And then also this feeling of helplessness as a result of that. Like, I love, Therese, that you brought up what this feels like for a lot of people in corporate America. I talk to so many people of color working in corporate, and just the lack of acknowledgement, even this week, that they have seen from their employers, from their colleagues, has been overwhelming. And to then have to experience this entire week and then be pushed into an environment where you have to pretend like nothing ever happened, that you're still, going to meetings and you're still, trying to bust out reports, that is so invalidating to a person's experience. And those feelings of helplessness just sort of arise, because it's like, while the world may be changing, in my world, it seems like nothing has happened, nothing has changed, and I still have to operate in this way that is so in opposition to what's really happening in my life. So,
right. And I think that's absolutely. And I think, just to add on to that, I think, when you think about our stress responses, like our nervous system and our stress responses, like most people hear about, fight, flight, freeze, right? But there's also submit and attach. So there's fight, flight, freeze, submit, attach. And I bring that up because I think that, when I've had conversations with folks about this, some people are kind of like, especially like, people who don't have the lived experience of racism, and you tell them about a microaggression that you've experienced or someone else's experience. They're like, well, then why don't they just speak up? Why don't they just fight back? Why don't they just call it out? And it's like, that is such a privileged experience to be able to, to speak up in that sense. And I think that a lot of people, when they are experiencing microaggressions, tend to kind of submit, tend to kind of act like put their head down, act like it's not happening. I mean, and I don't know if you've ever been in big groups where this is happening, but it's so upsetting, when those microaggressions are happening and people just get really quiet, right? And to me, that's also a form of, that also can be a form of violence, right? That silence, that lack of acknowledgement. And I think right now, part of the reason why the white silence is so hurtful is that it's not naming the experience, right? It's not like saying, we see and we hear your pain and the trauma that you're going through. It's literally saying nothing, which is saying is saying something, right?
Yeah.
Thank you both. So you both mentioned collective trauma, and with everything that's going on right now, that we're all, I feel like we're all at like a heightened sense of awareness of our mental health, and just being at home because of COVID and kind of like facing everything in a way where there's less distractions. We're a little more aware of how we are feeling. So I wonder, what do you mean by collective trauma exactly? Now that we have talked about trauma specifically and racial trauma, what does that mean, collective trauma?
Collective trauma for me means the experience of a particular group of people based on the events or experiences of their lineage, right? And for many groups, I mean, obviously for Black people, that has been slavery, that has been colonization, that has been all these things. And really for any group that is non-white, because we have seen white supremacy reign over the world. So experiencing that and what that has done to the collective state, right? For example, when you think about the way that slavery had impacted Black Americans, right? These are things that are consistently brought up again and again and again. No matter how many generations we are removed from the actual time when we were actual slaves, we still have this trickle down impact of what it was like in that time. And then also all of the events that happen even in between the time of being enslaved and then being free in quotation marks, right? And so how those things then went into impact not only the mindset, but also the ways that in all ways, whether that be mentally, physically, and emotionally, that we were able to show up based on the fact that we were actively being traumatized throughout that time, and how we have continued to pass that down. And then now, what does that look like for us right now in this particular generation, right? Or in any of the generations that are still present with us, right? What does it look like for us to be still processing the events of the past, and how is it showing up in our active lives today? And when we can see the patterns and we see themes come up, that to me is what collective trauma looks like.
And what kind of patterns do you mean?
Patterns such as, for example, this internalized white supremacy, right? In the way that we have internalized anti-Blackness in many different ways, and it comes out in so many nuanced ways, whether it is our tendency to be hypercritical of things that are innate of Black culture, right? Or in the way that we may tend to demonize things, not humanize each other, and demonize that. I think that is really the biggest example that I see culturally. But then also just our sense of self-esteem, our sense of worthiness, our sense of feeling that we are capable and able to move forward in certain ways. I think that impact on our self-esteem, not that this is something that happens, to necessarily everyone, but that collectively that has had an impact on the way that we see ourselves and how we then will show up. And oftentimes it looks like us striving for Black excellence all the time, right? Because we didn't have an option to be mediocre. And someone so beautifully said, until we are able to just be like, until we're able to be basic, we're not liberated, right? Because we see that everyone else in every single group is able to be basic and that be enough, and they still strive and they're still able to have a life. But we have to strive for excellence in all things all the time, because there's so many things that basic is not enough for us. We can't have those same things if we are just existing. We have to be exceptional.
Right.
I think that is that is so powerful, everything you just said. And I think that it also shows up in just some of the symptomology that's similar to PTSD, right? When you think about post-traumatic stress disorder, there's 4 clusters. There's re-experiencing, which are like nightmares, flashbacks, etc. Avoidance numbing, which is literally like, I'm not going to think about it. I don't want to talk about it. Hyperarousal, that's the being on edge, easily startled. And then the negative alterations in cognition and mood, which are the more hypoarousal depressive symptoms. And you think about what people have been saying that they've been going through after witnessing this murder, which again is a trauma, another trauma, right? And a lot of people are saying like, I can't sleep. I'm having a lot of difficulty concentrating. I can't even focus. Like, I can't stop thinking about it. I don't want to think about it, but I can't stop looking at the news. And then even before this, it's like, how do Black folks feel around police in general? Right? That hypervigilance, that easily startled, those are trauma responses, right?
Yeah.
Even being in like a corporate boardroom, same thing, right? The being on edge, the feeling really like, like it's like what Naiylah is saying, like I have to make sure I am like on point 1,000% because I don't have the luxury of not being like that, because in general, I might not feel safe.
Yeah. I literally, every time I see a police officer, whether it be just like a benign situation or not, like a parade, for example, with my daughter, I always feel tense, like walking by, like I'm always watching them and making sure like I'm going to be okay.
Yeah.
And just being around them.
Yeah.
And I never thought of that as like a response to trauma.
Well, if you think about like, again, the body tells you everything, right? So like if you really start to think about the people in your life and the people that you interact with, who are the people that you really feel a sense of ease with, and who are the people that you're kind of clenching a little bit around, that's information for you. That's showing you that I don't actually feel that safe. Right. And that to me is such a poignant example of a different experience of police in this country.
Yeah, absolutely. I think even more recently, you can see how viscerally people react to being pulled over, right? Like my friend, she had a flat tire and she was like, pushing her car with her girlfriend and she's trying to get it to, on the side of the road, and then the cops pull up next to them, right? And this is late at night, and all of us, obviously, like the fear just comes up when you see, oh, okay, I'm in this situation and I'm not even doing anything wrong and I'm afraid, right? I'm actually in need of assistance and I'm still scared. So just thinking about collectively, and she herself has never been victimized by officers. She has never been brutalized by police, but she's been seeing it so much. We've collectively experienced it so much that immediately when you see an officer, you're like, okay, this something might happen. That is that response to seeing these things. And that's where that trauma can manifest itself.
Absolutely. Right. And I think that, even going up a generation, right? Like epigenetically.
Wait, what did she just say? I'm going to need Thérèse and Naiylah to explain exactly what that means.
But essentially, it pretty much means that like our genes are like influenced by our environment, and specifically like with our mother, we kind of carry like essentially like we carry the trauma from them like through the womb. And I think they've done a lot of studies on this with Holocaust survivors and other like collective trauma survivors, and just how the children of these survivors of trauma are more susceptible to anxiety and depression, et cetera. And there could be a lot of different factors for that.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, totally. Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. Essentially, it means that our experience has the ability to change and modify our genes, right? So we can be living a very typical existence, whatever typical or normal looks like, and then we can experience things, a series of things that can then have such an impact that it literally starts to change and restructure how our genes will then activate throughout our
Right.
throughout our bloodline.
Thank you for explaining that.
Right. Yeah. So if you think about it from like, and again, this is like, this field is somewhat newish. So there's not like a ton of data about that. Although there are active studies going on. But I mean, if you think about that, just from the pure, just coming from, descendants of the transatlantic slave trade, right? And then, slavery, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, mass incarceration. I mean, it's like, it hasn't stopped really, it hasn't stopped.
Right.
And even with the civil rights movement, right? Like police brutality was one of the main, catalysts for that movement. And here we are, how many years later, right? The things that our parents went through. So I just say that to say that beyond like, even if you come from that, it's also like the trauma is still happening. And most of us have experiences where we talk to our elders of their experiences of, racial trauma. Right. So this is really something that's very deep within our history.
Hey guys, Erin here. So that concludes part 1 of the Moving Through Racial Trauma episode. In part 2, we'll talk a little bit more about healing and coping strategies, and if healing is even possible. So check that out. Find it in the episode listings labeled part 2. Thanks, guys.